Powering today's episode with Jasmine Milk Tea Boba. I'm a fan of this one. When it comes to mental illness and mental health advocacy, stigma is a frequent topic of conversation. I'd always figured this word probably developed from some ancient Greek or Roman word that meant something like outcast. But when I finally got around to Googling it, I was in for a bit of a surprise. Yes, the origin was Greek, but it came from an unexpected source. To prick, puncture, or tattoo. So how did we go from Greco-Roman tattoos to the negative social impact that we associate stigma with today? Let's dive into this, shall we? The word for stigma actually comes from the Greek root word steizing. In fact, this root made its way into English as the basis for the word stick, which, among its many possible meanings, can include to pierce something. The word stigma in particular was originally used to describe the physical tattoo that one would get from using ink and needles on the skin. Tattooing in ancient Greece, and eventually Rome, involved inscribing symbols, words, or phrases into the skin through a series of needle pricks, eventually followed up by adding a mixture onto the skin that included black ink to color them in. It's believed that the ancient Greeks first picked up tattooing from the Persians around the 6th century. However, the original use case for tattoos in these societies wasn't decorative in the way that we see them today. Instead, they were typically a forced mark of punishment or shame, not unlike the practice of branding with hot irons. You'd usually find tattoos on criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, religious minorities, and other individuals deemed non-citizens. They were also intentionally placed on highly visible locations, like the face or wrists. As if all of this wasn't embarrassing and dehumanizing enough, the inscriptions themselves would literally add insult to injury. For example, there are records of slaves being tattooed with the message, "Stop me, I'm a runaway." These marks unironically stigmatized those bearing them, causing shunning, prejudice, and other negative social effects long after the cause of the tattoo itself. Tattoos could even bar you entry from certain cities and spaces. Based on this reality, tattoos had very real legal implications, marking you as a second-class citizen. We see some of the earliest examples of stigma being used as a metaphor. For example, when the Greek writer Ilias Aristides asserts, "You never tattooed any of your own slaves, but you have as good as tattooed the most honored of the Greeks," when accusing Plato, yes, that Plato, of slander. Today's fun fact: while stigma typically had negative implications, fast forward a few hundred years, and there would be a phenomena in Catholicism referred to as stigmata. Essentially, when a figure believed to have lived a highly virtuous life displays bodily marks similar to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ. Apparently, the first case of this happening was with Saint Francis of Assisi back in the 13th century, who eventually became the patron saint of Italy and the basis for the name San Francisco. Stigma's shift from the physical to the figurative would crystallize thanks to the work of Irving Goffman, a Canadian-American sociologist and psychologist who specialized in examining the rituals involved in interpersonal interactions, and how these, in turn, shape people's perception of social reality. In 1963, Goffman formally defined stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting. In other words, a trait that makes you both different from others and undesirable in a given social setting. These traits could range from visible physical characteristics to the less obvious at first glance, like religious beliefs or a criminal past. Originally, I was going to go for something fancier, but sometimes the basics are where it's at. Other intellectuals built on Goffman's work. In 1966, American sociologist Thomas Sheff, who specialized in emotions and their impact on social connections and interactions, developed labeling theory. The idea that labeling certain people is primarily society's attempt to process certain behaviors that it deems deviant or straying away from an accepted norm. Labeling theory also suggests that over time, the labeled individuals may come to imitate the stereotypes and expectations placed upon them. And not because they always inherently possess these traits, but because of the labeling contributing to an environment which influences them to unconsciously shift their behavior over time to meet these expectations. A self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. This in turn has raised an interesting question. Is there really such a thing as mental illness? Or is this just a label to explain away the furthest ends of the spectrum of human behavior? Maybe the answer is somewhere in between. There are too many other examples of transformative research on stigma that have been done since the 1960s to cover in just one video. Like a ton. For example, distinguishing between public stigma versus self or internalized stigma and the interplay between the two, the impact of stigma on self-esteem, the impact of stigma on seeking help or counseling, and the list goes on. Today, stigma is considered to be any negative assumptions, beliefs, or attitudes that someone faces due to certain characteristics, conditions, or symptoms they may have. We now understand that it often goes hand in hand with discrimination. If stigma is the negative light in which people see you, discrimination is the negative way in which people treat you as a result. We also now understand that beyond public and self-stigma, there is also structural stigma, when systems like governments or organizations create or enforce policies that reinforce or prolong stigma towards groups who are already heavily stigmatized, like those facing poverty and homelessness, or those who have completed their prison sentences, or even those in need of mental health resources. Finally, we also understand that stigma is one of the largest barriers to access for those in need of mental health help today, whether it be from fear of other stigma towards them in accessing these services, or the dampening effect of internalized shame towards themselves. Through exposure to, education about, and empathy towards the individuals and conditions so frequently stigmatized by our society, we can begin taking steps to reduce, and hopefully one day altogether erase, some of these social tattoos. That's all for now. If you're interested in deep dives like this, or some of the topics covered in this video, then please check out my channel, and like and subscribe for future content. Thanks so much for watching. Jasmine milk tea boba. Pretty good.